I'm David Garfunkel. I'm here with my friend of 40 years and former colleague at the public defender, Mark Sisti. As we all know, Mark is one of the preeminent criminal defense lawyers in New Hampshire. We're going to talk with Mark about his career, but we're going to start with a little bit of history. So Mark, could you kind of tell us where you grew up?
Yeah, I will tell you. I grew up in a few different places, primarily Buffalo, New York, and Baltimore, Maryland. Went to several different schools. My father and mother moved around quite a bit. And so different elementary schools, different junior high schools, different high schools. Went to college in Buffalo, New York at Canisius College, and then came out to New Hampshire for law school.
And talk a little bit about your life influences growing up and the rather interesting employment history you had.
No, it's a different history than a lot of folks that we run into in this profession. I'll go back a little bit. My father was a certified Lincoln Mercury mechanic. My mother did secretarial work, not only for law firms, but for Harley Davidson shops and other places. My father was a mechanic. He worked on stock cars as well. He built engines. And he was a self-taught mechanical engineer, and towards the end of his life was able to actually grab jobs in major corporations, even though he never graduated from high school.
And what did you do?
I was taught at a very early age with auto mechanics, so that gave me a little bit of a jump. I was able to work through high school and so forth at different auto shops, gas stations. I had a wonderful job in the winter once changing snow tires in Buffalo, New York, things like that.
Did it snow in Buffalo?
It snowed a little bit in Buffalo. New Hampshire's like Miami compared to Buffalo. My uncles were primarily iron workers, and they were able to get me into the trade. I think I was 18 when I started with the iron workers in Buffalo. And I worked steel all through college, and the first year and a half I was at law school.
So times were tough back in the 70s, but you were doing okay as an iron worker.
In the early 1970s, I was able to buy any car I wanted. I paid college all 4 years with cash. And law school was not a problem either as far as tuition.
Because you continued to do that work while you were in law school, right?
I did, yeah. In the summers, I was able to work jobs up here and got around a little bit and actually worked for the law school. I built all of the bases for all of the library furniture, welded all that together in the parking lot, did a bicycle rack for them, did a spiral staircase for them. So I was actually working with them for the first year. Second and third years there in law school, I worked at the maximum security ward of the New Hampshire hospital, which was eye-opening.
You did that in the evenings?
During school, I worked generally the 3 to 11 shift or the 11 to 7 shift. I had to creep out of class early on occasion. I had a professor who was very understanding by the name of Jim Duggan at the law school, and he would let me sit in the back of the room during federal courts, and I would just kind of move out of there quietly around 2:30 or so.
And what prompted you to go to law school?
That's an interesting question, actually. I didn't know any lawyers as a kid. My family wasn't at that particular, I guess, stature or status. I mean, we didn't have doctors as friends or lawyers as friends or anything. But on the west side of Buffalo, New York, the legend in Buffalo, New York was a guy by the name of Antonio Cellino. And frankly, on the west side of Buffalo, New York, Nino, as they called him, was the guy, the go-to guy. He was more powerful in the eyes of the people in town than any mayor or any police officer or any judge. He got things done for you. And when I saw that, I said, this is the guy to be like, you know. And That's what I shot for.
So he was the famous lawyer in Buffalo.
He was the guy.
I remember there was a similar lawyer when I was a young public defender in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I mean, and everybody knew him. There must have been a million of them because he went to every graduation, every marriage, every funeral. I mean, he was everywhere.
He was a good businessman.
He knew how to advertise before advertising was legal. Let's put it that way. He knew how to do it.
So you worked your way through law school as a welder and worked at the state hospital.
Right.
And then your first job out of law school was something that we have something in common since I was the one that hired you.
Yeah, when I was asked who I wanted to be interviewed by, I said, well, there's only one guy I want to interview me, and that's David Garfunkel. And that's because 43 years ago, you interviewed me for the public defender job. And it was an interesting interview, and I thought I probably brought something to you that you hadn't seen before in an interview, and I thought it went very well, actually.
We interviewed over a six-pack of beer.
Yes, we did. We interviewed over a six-pack of beer, and you called me back for a second one, and I was offered a job. At the time, a new office in Rockingham County, the Exeter office at that time.
And what is it that attracted you to the public defender program?
Wow. I think it's the people I was raised with, or the people I was around. That would be one. Coincidentally, my apartment in Concord, New Hampshire was right across from the old public defender office.
The very old public defender
On
office.
136 North Main Street. So I knew everybody in that office. I was quite comfortable with those folks. I was comfortable with the subject matter. I felt confident I could master it. And with the right mentoring. I mean, I didn't know what I was really walking into because I didn't have anybody to pattern myself after, other than some folks that I saw through law school and some of my professors and so forth. But as far as actually being in a courtroom environment and so forth, that was completely foreign to me.
Did you have a grandmother that had some influence over that?
I did, actually. That's another interesting aspect. She's Sicilian, but she mastered the English language better than probably anybody in the neighborhood. She came over when she was very young, spoke fluently, very little accent, but of course could read and understand Italian and Sicilian. I want to make sure people understand there's two different things there. When the folks in town needed something read to them or needed a liaison to stand up for them, whether it be because of a contract dispute or a landlord-tenant thing, just anything, or their kid got in trouble, she would explain what these papers were to them in Italian or in Sicilian, and actually take them to the county offices and so forth and get them to the right people. She was kind of strangely put, she was kind of like the legal assistance of the neighborhood. And I used to see that every day on the front porch. And I thought the world of her for doing that.
And how did that influence your decision to become a public defender?
That's what I wanted to do.
Was help people.
Yeah. And I think, that's what we all wanted to do. I mean, the crew that I came up with, I'll be quite frank with you, I mean, we all loved each other. That's the strength behind that whole outfit. And we were there for each other. And we knew we were in a new situation. This was not an institution at that point. The public defender was new.
We had just opened that Rockingham County office.
Brand new. And we had to depend on each other. We had to depend on guys like you that you knew the ropes. I mean, New Hampshire wasn't Philadelphia, but you learned quickly too. We were all in this very steep curve of learning. I think because of that, we appreciated the efforts we had to put in.
You had an interesting first day experience as a public defender?
I was thrown into a 7-count burglary probable cause hearing in Portsmouth District Court. Again, I had never really done court work before. I remember the judge, his name was Flynn, and I remember the client, whose last name was Cervantes. And We went on for about an hour and a half of probable cause. And at the end of the probable cause hearing, lo and behold, the judge found no probable cause. And we walked out of the courtroom, and I thought to myself, this is about the easiest job I ever had in my life. No heavy lifting, people believe you, and you walk out with your client. It was about the last time that happened, as easy as that, but it was an interesting beginning.
And how would you describe your first year as a public defender?
We chatted about this before, and I'm not going to even refine this. But the reason I'm going to say this is because it comes from a couple different sources. I had an uncle that was a professional baseball player. He played for the Boston Braves, in fact, and from 1938 to 1954 when they moved to Milwaukee. And he would explain what it was like standing in a batter's box when somebody like Feller was pitching from Cleveland. They had gone up against each other in the World Series in '48. And he said it was two things. You had to exude confidence, even though you were absolutely, completely terrified. And I brought that with me even when I was an iron worker. It's the same thing. You have to exude confidence, you have to be confident, but you have to respect the environment that you're in. And it's terrifying. And for a young lawyer, just starting out, when you have the liberty of your clients at risk every day and every moment, and it's under your control to a point, it's terrifying, but you have to exude confidence.
And how did you manage that, being obviously in that circumstance as a young public defender with never having really had any courtroom experience before, and suddenly you were asked to defend people whose liberty was at stake?
I hope I managed it well. In retrospect, it was the people around me that probably helped me the most. I had great people around me, and when I look back, I go, it's almost as though it was you and Duggan, I guess, that were hiring, or at least interviewing these people. You had some recipe for success. The real question would be like, to you, I mean, I hate to interview you, but what was your secret sauce? What were you looking for, But the one thing we had in common is we all learned very quickly, I think. And we all knew what our weaknesses were, and we knew how to help each other out.
Back then, the public defender today, of course, is over 100 lawyers. Mm-hmm. But back then, you were one of
11.
How many? One of 11, and how many in Rockingham County?
Maximum 3 in Rockingham County, with 1 investigator, and we had 1 secretary, I think.
And of course, the program grew over the next 10 years when I was still affiliated with it. But back then, it was just getting started in Rockingham County and elsewhere in the state.
Well, we had 1 office in Concord that handled Laconia, which would be Belknap County, and Merrimack County. We had 1 office in Manchester that handled all of Hillsborough County, and part of Rockingham, actually, a little bit of Rockingham. We were starting to try to spill over a little bit into Stratford County.
And eventually opened an office in Dover there.
Got Dover. We had no full-time offices in the North Country.
Or in the southwestern part of the state at that point.
Right. It wasn't until like the second or third, 82 or 83, that we ventured into, I think, the western part
Cheshire
of
and
the state.
Sullivan.
Right.
And you had a rather interesting experience when you were in Rockingham County. You learned something about the fallibility of eyewitness identifications?
I did. When I was a lawyer in Rockingham County, I had a lot of hair. And
yeah, I had a lot of hair back then too.
And it was
funny how that happened.
Yeah, it's a lot longer than it is now too. And I looked very young. I mean, I look back at those pictures. I go, if I was a client of mine, I would have been scared how young I looked. But I did represent an individual in a very vicious armed robbery out of Derry. And what we did is we hired a ID expert from Brooklyn who was very well known at the time, and we convinced a judge to allow our client to sit in the back, not at counsel table, but in the back with other folks in the courtroom during the course of the pretrial examination to determine whether or not there could be an in-court ID. And at the table with me was this professor from Brooklyn who was about 55 years old. David Wolowitz was sitting with me, who was the office manager, who had shocking gray-white hair and was obviously looked like a lawyer, and you know, he was central casting lawyer. And then there was me sitting at the table as well with a ponytail, probably waist long. Not really the best suit on that I ever had on, but I was sitting there. And it became time for the witness to do the magic thing and point out, you know, who literally now stuck the gun in her face. And she looked around the courtroom, and she immediately, without any hesitation, pointed at me and said, "That's him." And I just sat there, and the other two guys at the table, the professor and Attorney Wolowitz, sat there. And the prosecutor at the time said, "Are you sure?" And she said, "Yes." And he asked the court if she could leave the witness stand and come over and touch the person that she was actually pointing to. And she walked directly over to me, stood behind me, placed her hand on my shoulder and said, "That's him. There's no doubt about it." And went back to the witness chair, at which point the prosecutor asked to approach the bench, and the judge at the time, a fellow by the name of Wayne Malavy, who, by the way, had a brush cut, and, you know, I mean, he was, you know,
I think those of us that are old enough all knew Judge Malavy.
Everybody. And had a very interesting sense of humor, I have to say that. But he was stone-faced during the whole thing. And he then asked for the defense counsel to come to the bench. And lo and behold, it wasn't the professor that walked up to the bench, and it wasn't David Wolowitz. I walked up to the bench. And you could just see this woman in the witness stand almost horrified as to what she had done. And the prosecutor asked the judge if he would dismiss the case at that point in time. And I cannot tell you how funny it was when Judge Malavy said, "Why? What's the problem?" to the prosecutor at that point in time. And he got the biggest laugh out of it. And the case was dismissed. But it's not the first time that I've seen this happen in courtrooms, and it's kind of scary when people have that set image in their mind and they pick out the wrong person.
Well, as you know, historically there have been doubts cast on the validity of eyewitness identifications, and it's been a constant struggle throughout the decades in the practice of criminal defense to try and challenge and establish that there's certain reliability questions that exist with eyewitness identification. But ultimately, Judge Temple addressed you, didn't he?
Yeah, what they did is, this you have to remember, this was, I think, 1981, where it was a little looser around here, and they thought they'd keep the ball rolling with the funniness over at Rockingham County. So I walked in after lunch one afternoon, shortly after this. David Wolowitz and I had gone to lunch, and we were coming back for the afternoon list. And we had heard that the court wanted to see us early, so we got there about 1 o'clock. And I was walking near the bailiff's station on the second floor, and all of a sudden the handcuffs came out. I was arrested by the sheriff's department, and I was charged with impersonating a criminal at that point in time, and brought into the courtroom before Judge Temple for a hearing.
Talk a little bit about the dynamic back then with the judiciary, the practicing bar. It was a lot smaller, and everybody knew everybody. Mm-hmm. So what was the atmosphere like back then?
It was a good atmosphere, or it could be a terrible atmosphere, because it's exactly what you just said. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody knew about everybody. You could either trust somebody or not trust somebody. So your word back then was more than it could ever be now. it's gotten to a point now where it seems as though things have become diluted or something. But back then, it would not be unusual for the judges at lunchtime to be in the same restaurant with the prosecution, with the criminal defense bar. There was a lot of collegiality. I think a lot of mutual respect. We all knew what we were, in for. We all tried to make the system much better.
And back then, there were no cell phones, text messages, emails. Everything was done face to face, right?
Everything was done face to face.
And your word was?
Your word was everything. And your word and your demeanor, your day-to-day lifestyle, it was always under the microscope. So you had to behave more, I think. And again, there weren't that many judges. You're right. God, there had to be less than 15.
I think that's right.
Yeah, in the entire state. And like I said, there was only 11 of us, so they had the book on us early. I mean, word travels quick from county to county and office to office, so we were not strangers in front of any judge. They already knew who we were before we stood up. But again, it was looser. I know that Judge Temple got a kick out of the ID thing. I was arraigned on being, impersonating a criminal. I entered a not guilty plea. He asked me if I wanted a public defender. I said no, I wanted a real lawyer. and the afternoon went on, but it was fun, and everybody had a good time. I don't know if you could get away with it in this day and age. That's all I can say.
Just so the people that are watching this at some point in the future know, we're sitting outside because we're still in the midst of a pandemic, and it's raining. So if my jacket begins to show dark spots, which it is, it's the rain that's falling from the sky, but we're under the trees, so we'll soldier on.
But it's healthier this way. We've made it through this thing.
Now, you started with the Rockingham County office, and you were handling then all sorts of cases,
Right.
except for one particular category.
Yeah, there was a restriction on the public defender office from handling murder cases. We could handle negligent homicide cases, attempted murders, but we couldn't handle murder cases. That was part of the contract. What they were doing is they were basically awarding those cases for the most part to assigned counsel. That broke through in 82.
82 or 80, was it 82, 82, 83?
82, yeah. And I transferred from Rockingham to Merrimack County and worked the Merrimack County as a line, lawyer. And then it had to be midway through 82 when we were finally given permission to do murder cases.
And how did we structure that new defense obligation that we had?
We actually had a specific unit that was put together. It was small, of course, but it was Paul Toomey, who was a wonderful lawyer, a good friend of mine, and Bruce Sartwell. He was our investigator. He had been, he was a captain, I believe, at the Goffstown Police Department. He was a chief deputy sheriff for Hillsborough County, decorated Vietnam veteran, a lot of gravitas. The guy knew the streets, knew the actors, knew law enforcement inside and out. We had basically a dedicated unit of just a few people, but your door was always open. Jim Duggan's phone line was always open. The whole office, really, everybody in the office was there to help, so we could go to anybody with questions. But we were dedicated to the murder cases alone, and they came in and they started coming in with great frequency.
And how did you gear up? How did you and Paul and Bruce prepare yourself to handle this new type of case, which obviously is the most serious case that can be brought here or anywhere in the country?
Right. We asked and received all the training that we could get. I remember going everywhere. Providence for things, Chicago, homicide clinics every place, special training in Washington. Any program we can get into, we'd go to. University of Houston, we went down National College of Criminal Defense. The investigators went to I think a death investigation training 2 weeks in St. Louis, I think it was. So the training was impeccable. I was still like a sponge as far as learning. I mean, I had only been a lawyer for 2.5 years, and began basically just doing first-degree murder cases and second-degree murder cases.
This was also exposure to a new prosecutorial arm in the state, right?
Yeah, we hadn't really worked with or against the Attorney General's office at the time. We were dealing with each individual county attorney's office. So this would have been the first round of really intense work with the Attorney General's office, and they had put together a wonderful, wonderful bunch of lawyers over there too. Most of them, I'm sure, have been interviewed for something that I've been being interviewed for.
We're here for posterity. Just let the folks who are going to be viewing this at some point know the names of some of those prosecutors, all of whom, some are on the bench, others are prominent and have been prominent litigators in New Hampshire.
Well, you're right. I mean, some are on the bench. Right now in Merrimack County, you've got Brian Tucker. He's on the bench. I must have had 4 or 5 murder cases with Brian. Michael Pignatelli was there when I started. Peter Masso when I started. Don Peralt when I started. I mean, the list just keeps going and going.
Greg Swope, Marty Van Hoot, right?
Yeah, I mean, they just keep going. I mean, and it was an awesome crew that was put together at the Attorney General's office. And they were great guys to work with, too, I have to be honest. Barbara Keshen ended up prosecuting for the Attorney General's office. We had a couple cases with her. So they had a wonderful field of lawyers up there. We knew we had to get up to speed. We hadn't done murders. We had to get up to speed. We had to look at these things a lot differently than what they had been looked at before.
And you began to bring in experts from around the country in various fields, blood, pathology, and so forth, right? How did you manage that?
Yeah, a lot of it came from us doing the reading. A lot of it was going to these seminars and talking to other people. And we had a couple of resources in the state that had worked with some of these folks on different projects when they were young lawyers in New York or young lawyers in New Jersey or something. I know that we brought in Michael Bodden from the New York City. He's a pathologist down there. He was their medical examiner. We brought him in early, and we used him often because, one, he was well regarded, wonderful on the stand, great educator, and he would give us a really fair assessment of what the case was going to be like and what we needed to do. We brought in forensic psychologists and psychologists from all over the country, blood and toxicology experts from all over the place. We were really trying to match up as best we could with the Attorney General's office. And I have to say that I think the edge we got in the early years was that our experts were better. We were able to pull from a much broader array of experts than the state was able to pull from.
And how did you and Paul Toomey approach these cases? Did you divide up and clearly delineate who was going to do what, or did you have a more fluid approach?
Well, we found out early that the best way to prepare for a case is to prepare for every witness. And we decided early on, and we trusted each other early on, that whoever was hot, whoever felt good that day, would be doing the bulk of the work. So it wouldn't be unusual for somebody that was going well, where you could tell that the jury was buying in and really accepting what was going on, to just keep going. It's like, don't stop winning until you lose. And we made a point of that. There were cases where Paul would have done the opening and closing. There were cases where I would have done the preview, the view at the view at the view, and the opening and the closing. This was not unusual. We would switch witnesses during trial. We'd figure out who was going well and who wasn't.
So it was a very fluid kind of read the room kind of approach to handling each case.
Yes, it was read the room, read the judge too. Was the judge seeming to accept more coming from Paul or me? Were things getting done better one way or the other? And we just went into that flow.
So that was very reactive, but required each of you to be fully prepared to try the whole case, essentially.
Absolutely. Everybody had to know everything. And I think it helped us because we were able to talk about the witnesses better. We weren't isolating ourselves from each other because we looked at these witnesses as being witnesses that both of us would have to deal with.
So you were with the public defender. We're going to talk in a moment about when you left, but you were there doing these kinds of cases, these homicide cases, for about 5 or 6 years, right?
82 to 88.
And what was, if you were to look back and say, these are the things that I really look back on and feel good about, what are the kind of the high points or high point as you look back on those years?
I think all the years, first of all, for me, were high points because this is a whole new life for me. I mean, this enabled me to do so many other things, but we'll get into that another time. But we did everything in this state because a lot of things hadn't been litigated. We challenged the way juries were selected in a case called State versus Albert.
Talk about that just a little bit.
I was only out of law school for 1.5 years, and a lot of things were theoretical. But we took a look at the way juries were selected statewide.
And how was that then?
It was scary. I mean, they were taking volunteers, they were taking what was called key man selections. Generally, selectmen would submit lists of people they knew or trusted. If they didn't know or trust you, you weren't on the list. There was no random selection, really. So we litigated that case. Clarence Albert was a black man from Kansas. He had murder convictions in California and Kansas, and he was charged with a rape in Rockingham County. And we found that there had never been a black person on a jury in Rockingham County, to anybody's recollection. So we brought in a racial angle and we brought in an age angle and took the attack that way. And 2 or 3 days of hearings. We lost, but then the Supreme Court in Albert basically directed the state to pick juries differently, and that's the system that we're actually dealing with now.
Which off the voters and driver's license lists.
Yeah, you know, the case actually went to the First Circuit under another heading. It was LaRoche versus Perrin. And LaRoche, we had joined with the Albert case, and I tried LaRoche, and it was an attempted murder. And we lost that, but then took the appeal to the First Circuit, and Joe Dickinson argued that for us. And we won at the First Circuit on the age disparity issue.
So, if you look back, what did you bring from the public defender that you carried into private practice?
Well, I think the first thing, it wasn't law books anymore. This stuff was real. I mean, we were actually litigating real suppression issues. We mentioned earlier in this interview the in-court identification problem in Rockingham County. Well, that's just theoretical stuff in law school. And it's the stuff of training and mythology and, you know, a couple of cases. And it became real. It was concrete. It really happens. And it's scary. And we've had lineups with people. I don't want to go into case specifics, but we've had suspects that they thought killed people. And we would be able to put lineups together, and people would come in and misidentify lineups. These were the kind of things that were no longer theoretical. These were things that really, really happened. And when you see them happen right before your eyes, I think it sharpens you a little bit, and it makes you much more critical of a case when you have an intake. You look at it harder.
So that was the experience and the real world experiences you brought to your private practice that you had experience in the public defender. How about the skills that you learned there?
Well, I mean, the skills, we were trained right. I mean, there's no question about that. I think the one edge that we had doing homicides, the edge was that it was statewide. So there was no courtroom really that was an away game. I know that Paul and I tried murder cases in every county in the state of New Hampshire. And I'm sure we've been to every district court in the state of New Hampshire because that's where the probable cause hearings used to be and the initial bail hearings. So there was no place that was strange to us. So when we got into private practice, We did a statewide practice. And again, there
That
were
was
no...
in about 1988?
88.
So you and Paul left and formed...
Paul had left a little earlier and had a solo practice in Manchester for about 6 months, and then I left after that. And we set up immediately in Chichester, New Hampshire, and I think about 4 months later, did an office in Portsmouth with Alan Kronheim. Not another year went by, and we set up an office in Plymouth with Greg Swope from the Attorney General's office. I mean, we expanded. We basically took the template of the Public Defender's office and made private offices run much like the Public Defender office.
And you also expanded your practice into the federal courts, didn't you?
Yeah, there was something we noticed when we
The
started.
mosquitoes are... Everybody sees me flashing in front of my eyes. The mosquitoes there. Go ahead.
They're
I'm
not
sorry.
coming on me. They're all over you.
Well, you know.
That'll tell you something.
It will, but we won't get into that.
No, I mean, it was one of those deals where we were looking around and we were going, most of these federal practitioners seem to be lawyers from Boston. It's like, why is this happening? The federal court's right here. So we started to concentrate on some of that practice. This was before the federal defenders had established themselves. So we were picking up cases from federal court.
Both retained and appointed.
Oh, both, yeah. And it was fine. Our trial skills were okay. We had to learn some federal rules, but the federal rules they're pretty, they're straightforward. There's nothing all that confusing about it. And we got to try some really wonderful cases in federal court.
So, talk a little bit about what the Sisti and Toomey practice was all about. What were you doing? Were you doing court-appointed work? Were you doing retained work? Were you hiring people? What was going on?
Yeah, the bulk when we started, we took a lot of assigned work, but we found out that there were people out there that wanted to hire privately. So quickly we were picking up a good deal of private work in every possible category, from motor vehicle to murder cases and the federal court system. Expanding, hiring new lawyers, hiring new staff, basically getting pretty big. I think at one point in time I had 4 full-time offices, maybe 5, fully staffed in 4 or 5 different counties.
And as you hired new lawyers, what were you looking for?
I was trying to look for the same people that you found, and some of them were. I hired some public defenders. Obviously, Alan Kronheim came up through the legal assistance and public defender system. He was well acclimated to the Portsmouth, Rockingham area, fit right in. Everybody knew him in Portsmouth. You would think he's the mayor now there. I have no idea what's going on over there.
But he's still with you, right? You and he.
Still with
yes.
us, yeah. He came in, like I said, '89, I think. But we wanted skilled, honed trial lawyers.
And what was the competitive atmosphere like for criminal defense work?
Back
then?
I found it, I think we stepped into it, to tell you the truth. There weren't that many out there, or the ones that were out there concentrated in their own little neighborhood. They would work within a 25 to 30 mile radius, and we were statewide and federal. So they could pick from us for all different kinds of reasons, and we would go anywhere. I think now it's become very, very competitive, maybe overly specialized. I think, I hate to sound like some old guy or something, but
you are an old guy.
I am an old guy now. But the advertising, I don't know what it does really. I don't know if it really helps people really pick out the right lawyers or not. We don't really put a lot of time and effort into advertising.
You had one case that obviously was, I know you said to me, certainly not the most difficult, not the most challenging, but perhaps the most famous, Pam Smart, who you still represent.
I still represent Pam, and I'll represent Pam until she walks out the door of the Bedford Hills Women's Penitentiary right outside of wonderful New York City.
And without disclosing any client confidences or getting into any substance, since you're still your client, what do you think created this huge aura around this trial with movies and TV shows and obviously international coverage in the press?
Apparently, it was the first murder trial covered gavel to gavel, I guess, in the history of murder trials in the United States or the world. Did we want it covered gavel to gavel? No, we did not want it covered gavel to gavel. And we fought like crazy to keep it from being covered gavel to gavel. But it was, and it wasn't, I would say it wasn't handled very well with regard to the media. There were no strict rules with regard to the media. They ran amok from what we could tell in the courtroom. Up and down the aisles in the hallways, circus-like atmosphere in the parking lot. It was embarrassing. It wouldn't happen today. We've grown, and the system in New Hampshire's grown, and the judges now know how to handle this situation. It was not handled well.
And perhaps, sadly, these kinds of cases, it's more commonplace to see these kinds of things. I think we've been saturated by the criminal law, both the TV shows and news coverage, and much of that wasn't in existence back when the Pam Smart case was brought.
That's right. I mean, there wasn't any court TV. You couldn't take a look on your phone and see a trial going on in Chicago, which you could do right now. None of that was going on. It was the show. It was a show. And it was disgusting. It was yards and yards and yards of individuals lined up outside the courtroom waiting to get a precious seat inside the courthouse. They were doing it through a lottery system. It was terrible. That's all I can say. It was not a good atmosphere.
What do you think the publicity, the TV shows, the news coverage, both fictionalized and actual of the criminal justice system? You can't open the newspaper today without some case being featured, right, or watch the news and they lead with crime. How do you think that's affected the perception, both from juries and judges and the public generally, of the criminal justice system?
Well, I mean, to start with, I don't think the media's ever done a criminal defendant any favor out of the blocks, let's put it that way. The first article and the first photograph of my clients is always the worst photograph and the worst article you're ever going to see. It's their worst day. It's when they were arrested. It's the first opinion, which is the police opinion. So, I mean, the first article is the worst. The first television coverage is the worst. And you're fighting uphill all the way from there. It also raises expectations that are, I think, delusional. Most courtroom work is quite boring. And people have to understand most of it's done at a very low level, and most of it's kind of neighborhood justice. It's in district courts. It's where most of the problems should be solved, and apparently, because of the new legislation, we'll be doing more work out of district courts again. There aren't wonderful, fantastic jury trials going on day to day to day. There are a few going on generally every day, but they're few and far between. And frankly, the issues in them are not, they're not overly attractive. The subject matter's not all that glamorous. And the work it's very hard and very, it can be boring, but it's hard.
Do you think that the publicity around the criminal justice system has impacted juries either negatively or positively?
Yes, and probably negatively. I mean, the three stories that opened today, just for history, were, today's July 5th, 2022. The three headline stories that opened this morning, from what I could gather were a Chicago, outside of Chicago, there was an incident on a parade where somebody with a high-powered gun, a 22 or 23-year-old guy, on top of a roof is accused of, I think, killing 6 or 7 people.
Six people and wounding 20-some.
Right. Then you move over and you're outside of Philadelphia, and you had 2 police officers shot during the course of a fireworks/parade. And then you have a stampede of people in Orlando that thought that a gunshot went off at a fireworks display, which caused shutting down the display and a stampede of people. And these are 3 gun-related, or one of them wasn't even gun-related, but I guess gun-type offenses that this country is waking up to and going to bed with every day now. It's as if violence is running amok in the streets. If you take a statistics kind of analysis, though, most of these major cities, believe it or not, have fewer gun-related problems statistically. All right, there are fewer murders, for instance, in Chicago this year than there were last year. There's fewer murders in New York City this year than last year. But you wouldn't know that from the news. You'd think people are dropping like flies in every major metropolitan area. I mean, I just came back from my hometown in Buffalo, where just a few weeks ago, there was a terrible shooting at a grocery store, which, by the way, was located about 3 blocks from where I went to college. And it was racially motivated, and it was essentially a slaughterhouse. Well, that neighborhood has been fighting to, cast that whole claim of being a tough, rough place off its back for 20 years, and they were getting there. It was cleaning up, it was looking good. And this just drives them right back, 20, 25 years ago.
How do you think that influences juries?
Boy. I think you can't help but think people charged with crime could be more violent than what you would have expected years ago. I think gun charges are going to be very difficult to defend. Anybody with a gun now is going to be presumed to be dangerous. It's difficult. And I think, racially we have to watch ourselves. Not just, I grew up in an all Puerto Rican Italian neighborhood in Buffalo. I didn't think anything of race, I'll be quite frank with you. I moved to Baltimore in 1965, the first year that they integrated schools in Maryland. And I couldn't believe what was going on down there. It was terrible, the way parents were treating little kids and teachers were treating little kids because of the color of their skin. We have to be very careful here. I think we're prejudging people too quickly. I think we have to be careful when we're picking jurors. We have to be much more careful.
You had an experience in Florida when we were down there with
yeah,
talk about whether we've gone ahead or moved back in terms of our race relations.
I was at a first appearance for a client in Polk County, which is outside of, it's Lakeland, that area, Central Florida.
And when was this?
This would have been a year and a half ago. My co-counsel was a well-established Lakeland, Florida lawyer. I think he was a 3rd-generation lawyer, well known in the area, and in fact had run that county's public defender program about 25 years ago. It was interesting. We almost had parallel career choices. I walked into the courtroom for the initial appearance and the setting of the bail, and about 25 defendants walked in. 24 of them were either Hispanic or black. One was a young white Jewish male. He was our client. None of the 24 had private counsel, and only one public defender was in the courtroom. The public defender had not spoken to any of them. At the end of the day, 24 individuals were refused bail and were incarcerated for further hearings, and one person walked out. And it would have been the person who was white and who had lawyers. It was not a coincidence, but it was terrible.
just to kind of depart from the discussion of the law and so forth, just kind of to talk about Mark Sisti, you're pretty active in your community. Don't you hold some town positions?
Yeah, I'm kind of amazed they keep electing me, but I'm the town moderator for Gilmanton. I'm the school district moderator for Gilmanton. I have a daughter, by the way, who's on the budget committee for Gilmanton. I have a son on the planning committee for Gilmanton. I mean, we all try to dedicate some time to our town, but I've been doing that. I've personally been doing it for 20 years now.
And why do you do it?
I like my community. I can do it. And running meetings for me in that kind of environment is almost refreshing compared to what I do day to day. And you know, they talk about small towns and how people can bicker and all that kind of stuff. I think we're very well trained as lawyers to deal with that. And we're really good listeners. And I think people appreciate it when you listen and when you give feedback that's positive instead of critical. And that's all you have to really do as a moderator, you know.
And I'm sure that that Gilmanton, like every place else in America right now, has political differences.
There's sharp lines that have been drawn.
And do you kind of have to work your way through that maze as the moderator?
That's the job. That's the whole job. I mean, the job really is to make sure everybody gets the vote and everybody has a say, which is the most important thing to do. And as long as people understand that it's a fair process, and we haven't had any complaints there, there's never any complaints. If it's fair and if it's transparent, then you're not going to have a problem. It's when you're playing these little games and these, you know, backroom games that people get angry, and they should.
So you've had an interesting career and an interesting personal life. It's starting in Buffalo and Baltimore, and you've certainly seen some of society's best and some of society's worst, as we all did as lawyers.
Right.
What is the thing you're most proudest of?
My proudest? Oh gosh, I mean, to me that's like the easiest question in the world. I mean, I have 6 wonderful kids. I have 7 grandchildren. This profession's allowed me to put all 6 of those kids through college, the ones that they wanted to go to. And they didn't do me a favor. They picked very expensive ones.
Yeah, the kids tend to do that.
But you know, I mean, you know, you pass it on, and you know, now we're working with the grandchildren, and they're all great. So that's the proudest thing, and you know, and it's actually kind of interesting because it is really kind of a professional thing too, because it does kind of like it kind of like bleeds over into your personal situation there. You're able to do things for people because of what you've done professionally.
And one of your daughters became a public defender.
One of the proudest moments of my life was that when my daughter became a public defender in New Hampshire.
Well, just a cute story, you may know this, is that, of course, your kids grew up around me when we were doing the public defender, and I was doing a training, criminal defense training, and this very attractive young woman comes up to me in the middle of it, and she says, "You don't know who I am, but I'm," and I won't use your daughter's name, but I'm.
You can use her name.
I'm Emma Sisti. Right. And I went, "Oh my gosh, did I feel old?"
Right.
And she said, "And I'm a public defender."
Right.
And I thought the life moves in a full circle. It really is remarkable. But yes, and actually your daughter appeared in front of me when I was on the bench.
Right. And my son-in-law, her husband's a public defender right now. And you know, I kind of think it's nice. I mean, we kind of pass the torch. And you know, I like seeing them work. They're really good, and they're fun to watch. And you can't become more proud than watching somebody take up your craft and hone it and do better at it than you have. And that's what I've always hoped for my kids, you know.
And as a lawyer, what do you look back on as some of your the moments that you feel the proudest about?
I think it's kind of, it's nuts, but I really love my clients, and I try real hard for them. And I don't look at this, you know, I looked at being a mechanic as a job, I looked at being an iron worker as a job, a scary one, but I mean a job. I looked at working at the state hospital as a job, but I've always looked at being a lawyer as being kind of a craft or a calling, maybe a calling more than a craft. And if you're lucky enough, you'll learn it well enough that people will depend on you and people will listen to you and you'll be able to help them. And that's what I'm most proud of, is giving people second chances. I've seen people that the state wanted to put away for decades and decades and decades on the street, doing well, getting that second chance. And that's what I'm proud of.
And I know you've practiced not just in New Hampshire, but you've certainly taken your craft elsewhere.
Right.
Florida, you've been in a number of states. How would you compare what you've seen outside of New Hampshire with the system here?
I think the people of New Hampshire should go outside and take a look around. The system in New Hampshire, it may not be the best, but it is a lot better than some of these states that I've practiced in. We talked about Florida. What I saw down there was embarrassing. Every one of those individuals should have had a lawyer for them, standing up for them. I've practiced in California where we had a case dismissed in Orange County because they couldn't impanel a jury under the statutory time limit in California, and if they can't do that, the case is dismissed forever. It's with prejudice. I've had the wonderful opportunity of practicing a little bit in New York. I got to practice in Ontario, Canada, and Quebec. New Hampshire, by far, has the best system that I've seen. And I'd tell you if it wasn't. I'm admitted in Vermont. It's got a great system. New Hampshire's better.
And what is it that distinguishes New Hampshire from these other jurisdictions?
I think New Hampshire lawyers and New Hampshire judges are still holding on to that thread of integrity and professionalism that's still out there. It's not as tight and it's not as strong as it was, I think, when I first started, but it's still there. And there's still a very tight group in the core in New Hampshire, still tight, where integrity means a lot, and a handshake means a lot, and a friendship means a lot. And that's what makes it different.
Well, Mark, it's been a real pleasure. I want to thank you for asking for me to interview you. I've watched your career from the day I hired you to today. You've made a real difference in New Hampshire. You and Paul both have distinguished yourselves in the profession, and I think you should be proud of what you've accomplished, both professionally and personally, with your life and your children.
Well, I appreciate that, David, but when I got the phone call from the New Hampshire Oral History Group, I thought it was a phone call for me to interview you, okay? So I thought I'd flip the switch, but we did flip the switch, and I hope the opportunity comes where I'm sitting over there and you're sitting over here, because I think you have a lot more to say and a lot more that you can impart on people for the history in the state of New Hampshire.
Thank you very much.